Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Vivek and Vandana Sharma India lecture. This is the 16th in the series, and I'm Ravi Ramamurthy, Professor of International Business at the Damol McKim School here at Northeastern, and also the Director of the Center for Emerging Markets. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers, and I'm going to get straight to it so we can maximize the time we have with them. We have Devesh Kapur and Arvind Subramanian. I see Arvind is on the screen there. Very briefly, you've seen their bios, so I'm not going to dwell on their backgrounds. But Devesh is right now the Paul Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins. And Arvind Subramanian is a senior fellow at the Pearson Institute in Washington. They have very distinguished careers prior to the current positions that they hold. And over the last few decades, they have done some of the most original work on India. Now, in India, there's a term called Jugalbandi that I know you folks have used in some of your talks. The idea of Jugalbandi, and Devesh, or I should say Arvind, is an expert on classical music, so he's going to say what I'm saying is not correct. But my sense of Jugalbandi is not just you have a duet, you have two players or two singers, but they bring very different styles, and you blend the two different styles. So you might have a North Indian classical musician singing with a South Indian classical musician, and they're different styles, but when you put them together, you get some very interesting things happening. So the Jugalbandi here involves a political scientist, which is Devesh, working with an economist, which is Arvind, which rarely happens. Is that a fair statement? Right? Our disciplines and our silos, we like to stick to them. So here are two scholars who have done very interesting work independently over the years and now have put their heads together for the last few years, I think 5 or 6 years, working on the project, resulting in this book, which I wish I could show you. It's not available in the US. It's been released in India, but it's still not available in the US. But it's a 700-page book. The one thing I want to say about both Arvind and Devesh, and the reason I have very great respect and admiration for their work, is that unlike a lot of academics, they are not just speaking to other academics. They take interesting real-world issues and use whatever tools are necessary to begin to understand those issues. And they are very eclectic in how they approach their topics. And one of the nice things that they do is while they use data to guide their research, or in the process of their research, they don't get into some rabbit hole of methodology or econometrics, and we lose sight of the big picture. They always seem to use data in very creative ways. And I like to think that somehow data talks to them in ways it doesn't talk to other people. So you have a very nice relationship with the data, and you get it to tell you stories that others miss. And so to have the two of them work together, bringing these two different perspectives on a very important country over a 70-year span since the country became independent, this is really, you don't get too many books like this. I was telling Devesh, it's probably time to retire because you can't top this, can you? Devesh, it's very hard to do something better than this. So let me extend a welcome to Arvind and Devesh. Arvind was going to be here. Unfortunately, he had an injury which prevents him from traveling, so he's joining us remotely. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Devesh. And the format we're going to follow is Devesh will speak for a while, talk about some of the main findings of the book, and then turn it over to Arvind. And after that, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. Okay? Thank you.
Can you tell me when I'm crossing 15 minutes? Okay. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry that Arvind couldn't join us, but as Ravi said, he's come down with a severe sort of injury that makes it very hard for him to travel. So, okay, now that's better. Okay, so what we're going to do is, because Arvind is in DC, he has the master slide deck. So we're going to do it such that I'll turn to him to change the slides. So, Arvind, next slide. So what I'm going to just talk to you a little bit is sort of overview about the book, what is sort of different about this book. Then what are some of the main themes that run through the book? What are some of the paradoxes of India that we find in the course of researching this book? And we end with a big final question. Next slide. Next slide, Arvind. Yeah. Okay. So, so the basic, I think, as Ravi said, it's a very interdisciplinary book. Our approach was we did not approach this book with any strong prior hypotheses which we wanted to prove or disprove. Our approach was basically we put together original data sets on a whole range of issues and variables. We did that through about 3,000 sort of original government reports and documents. That's the basis of building these data sets. All the data spans India since independence, by and large, from the 50s to around 2020. The other is we compare India with other countries, especially China, because that's the logical giant to compare with, but also other emerging markets. So the book, however, it's 750 pages, but we do not have any prescriptions at the end. This book is not about prescriptions. It's about looking back and trying to understand what happened and why. Next slide. So what were some of the challenges that India faced at independence? It had to reconfigure a colonial state into a development state. It had to transform one of the most hierarchical and stratified societies. It had to forge a sense of nationhood from one of the most complex, ethnically complex societies. And it had to create markets for economic development. Crucially, it attempted to do so through universal franchise-based democracy. Other successful countries followed different paths. Next slide. So if you see here, these are the quintessential development stories are the Western story, the US, UK as examples. And what you see is that on the x-axis is per capita income, on the y-axis is a democracy index. And what you see is that in the US, UK, gradually over time, as incomes increase, the democracy index also grows. So they grow in parallel. A second story is the East Asian story, the Taiwan and the South Koreas, where you first get economic development, you reach a middle income status, then you get the democracy. A third model is China, tremendous economic development, no democracy. The fourth model, which is India, it starts off with the democracy at extremely low levels of income and education. And it is a complete outlier in that respect. Next slide. Next, yeah. So what we, yeah, sorry. So what we sort of write in the book is that, look, in the Indian story, and I'll just read it out, with class cleavages worse than in England, religious cleavages akin to Northern Ireland, ethnic cleavages like Nigeria, a polylinguistic polity like Papua New Guinea or the European Union, social hierarchies of caste as deeply divisive as the racial hierarchies of the US, gender inequalities and patriarchy compared to many of the countries in the Arab world, and a population comparable to all of these above combined. No country like India in the 20th century had attempted these multiple transformations, all of them through the democratic means. Next slide. So what you see is, I think, Arvind, we've skipped one slide, the one on, so the graph. No, yeah. So here, what you see is the incomes at which countries achieved full franchise. And you see how much of an outlier India is compared to the other countries which we regard as vibrant democracies. The second graph shows you the gap between full and male franchise. We know that most countries in the West first gave franchise to males, and gradually over time, women got the franchise. You can see a country like Switzerland, it gives it at the gap between full franchise and male franchise was more than a century. But India, despite being such a strong patriarchy, it still is, but at that time it was much more so, it decided to give at very low levels of income, universal franchise, and men and women at the same time. Next slide. So, what were the key events at the beginning that shapes India going forward? First, there's a rupture. The rupture is with the colonial power, and that's relatively peaceful. Second, there is vivisection. British India is torn apart, and that is accompanied by massive amounts of violence. The third is assimilation, which is the assimilation of about 40% of the current territory of India, which comprise the 560 odd princely states that get absorbed into the Indian Union. Next. So what were the fateful choices early on? Some were unique, some were contingent, and some reflected the zeitgeist of the times. What were the unique ones? As we said, universal-based franchise was very, very distinctive. The second was affirmative action for socially marginalized groups. No country had done that at that time. A few countries have done that since then, to Malaysia, South Africa, but they've done it for the majority group. In this case, it was for the minority groups. The third was that the nation would not be built on any singular identities of language, religion, or ethnicities. The contingent choices was leading up to independence, the Congress Party, the general feeling was India would be very decentralized. But the extreme violence and chaos of partition frightened the leaders, and that's what led to a much greater centralization. The choices that reflected the zeitgeist were state-led industrialization and import substitution. That was not a distinctive choice. Most countries that were coming out and becoming independent in the 50s, that was broadly what all developing countries were trying to do. Next. Yeah, skip this. Yeah. So one of the things we show in the book is that one of the singular payoffs of India's choice of choosing democracy, that unlike what many people think, India has unusually low levels of violence in the process of nation building compared to other countries when they were in the similar stages of nation building. To take the US. The US has a civil war 100 years after independence, roughly. 2% of the population are killed. If that happened to India, that would be 30 million people. And what you see on the x-axis is the fatalities as a percentage of the population. As you can see, in the case of Vietnam, it is unusually high, and we know why. And on the x-axis is the per capita income. And you see how much India is an outlier in the relatively low levels of violence compared to its population, compared to other countries in the process of sort of nation building. And we argue that that was one of the unheralded successful outcomes of being democratic and being able to address differences in peaceful ways. Next slide. So this is, when we look at order and violence after independence, what we show in the book is that starting from the late 60s to the late in the 90s, violence actually grew over time. And then every type of violence which we looked at gradually begins to fall in the last quarter century. The one violence that has not really fallen very sharply, which still continues, is communal violence. Next slide, Arvind. Now, we find a similar parallel. India created macro order, not just in the political sense, which is that the levels of violence were relatively less. But for economists, the way they measure order is inflation. So inflation is a manifestation of disorder. And here we compare India with a set of developing countries like Turkey, Brazil, Korea, Indonesia, and so on. And here also you see that other than a blip after the first oil shock in 1973, India has had much lower levels of inflation compared to comparable countries. And we argue here again, democracy played a role. It's not that the India central bank has statutory independence or something, but because the poor in India vote in very large numbers. Inflation is anti-poor. Politicians know they will face severe electoral costs if inflation is high. And so in other words, democracy itself is the monetary anchor. And the task of the Reserve Bank, India's central bank, is relatively easy, sort of in that sense.
Devesh, can I just can I just say one thing very quickly?
Yeah, please.
Just to add to what Devesh said, that what is really pernicious for society is not just inflation, but hyperinflation. And many developing countries around the world over the course of nation building had many episodes of hyperinflation, which India completely avoided. So India avoided extreme economic disorder in the form of hyperinflation, and also what we show in the book also avoided financial crises, especially after 1991. Sorry, Devesh.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Arvind, next slide. Now, the paradox was that despite achieving macro order, India micro disorders were rampant. And by that, we mean that basic rule of law in India has been much weaker. And this is the paradox when you see it achieves macro order, it does not achieve micro disorders. And one way is if you just look at the number of cases pending in courts, that just shows the lack of resolution. And they've increased by orders of magnitude, so sort of since independence. And even if you normalize by population, by anything. So, the irony is India has one of the lowest incarceration rates in the world, but it has the highest rate of prisoners who are under trials. 3 out of 4 of all prisoners, people in jail, are under trials because the cases are just in court for years and years and years. Next slide. Now, in part of the book, the focus on nation building, and the reason we have so much of a focus on nation building, if you look at large federal countries around, Pakistan, Sudan, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, all of these countries have fallen apart. It is much harder to keep large entities together than we might think. Many countries, large countries, have broken apart, and therefore, what India achieved and the instruments and tools it used for nation building are very, very important, like to look at. One of the tools was the nature of India's fiscal federalism. So the broad idea is that we know that in all large countries, there are poorer parts, there are richer parts, but what you don't want is the poorer parts of a country to feel that it is better for them to leave the union than be part of it. So what you see here is fiscal transfers to poorer states, how they've increased over time, both as transfers as a share of GDP as well as per capita. And the broad idea being that someone in India's northeast should have recourse to similar levels of fiscal resources as someone in India's south. Now that comes with other problems, which Arvind will talk about later. Next slide. The other ways, of course, of nation building is that you want to manage at least severe inequalities in societies across different social cleavages. In India, the key cleavages are around gender, caste, religion, and region. The region one we showed you, they tried to address it through fiscal transfers. This of course, particular cleavage is a cleavage that democracies find hard to address because it's inside households, right? And it's much harder to reach for a democracy inside a sort of household. But here also you see it's not by any means there is equality, but there is less inequality compared to the very stark inequalities that were there. And if you just look at, say, education, primary education or higher education, you can see how gradually parity is being achieved. And one sort of driver of this gradual increase is in the last row, a very sharp decline in fertility rates, especially in the past quarter century, so that India today, the fertility rate is below replacement level. Next slide. Now, one area that India actually, we argue in the book, failed in the instruments of nation building is at the third tier of government. So what this graph shows you is the 3 largest countries in the world: China, India, and the United States. And what the graph is showing you, at what level of government are public employees employed. China and the US, with very different political systems, in both of them, most public employees are at local levels of government. Now, local levels of government is where you get the local public goods, garbage removal, the potholes in the roads, local schools, public health, all of those. Those are where India's failures are very manifest. And one reason we argue is that in India, the real centralization is not about the relationship of New Delhi vis-a-vis the states, but the relationship of the states vis-a-vis their local governments. India is highly centralized at the second tier, not at the first tier. Next slide. Now, in parallel with the nation building, if you think of nation building as software, state building as hardware, and state building requires a state is a territory, and you need a physical connectivity in the state. And what we show, and Arvind will talk about it more, is that public investment in India in the first 3 decades was so focused on state-owned enterprises, it really ignored public infrastructure. So one way we capture that is the number of major bridges per 1,000 kilometers of river length. So India's in the northeast, where the Brahmaputra flows, over 1,200 kilometers of the river had just one bridge till the 80s. Bihar, one of India's the largest states, across the whole state had just one bridge across the Ganga. Severe underinvestment. And you can see from 91 to 2022 how much that began to change. So a real change in public infrastructure spending after economic reforms. Next slide. Another way that we think about state building is state presence. So historically, if you look around the world, people look at 3 variables to see, is the state present in a space, which is a post office, a police outpost, and a public school, right? We've added a few more, and you can see that slowly, India's 600,000 villages, gradually the state came closer and closer to them, if not cognitively, at least in a physical sense. Next slide. Now I'll turn it over to Arvind.
Thanks, Devesh. Thanks, Ravi, for the kind introduction. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. So as Devesh was saying, one of the themes in the book is precociousness, i.e., the idea that a country does something, before its time compared to other countries, or does something very irregular. And Devesh spoke about the political dimension of that, which was, democracy before development. But there was an economic dimension to that as well, which is shown in this graph, which kind of everyone knows. The 3 panels are basically the share of the economy, agriculture on the left, formal manufacturing in the middle, and high-skilled services on the right. And kind of it's well known, and the way we put it is to say that India had prolonged ruralization, premature deindustrialization, and precocious servicification. So basically, too much agriculture for too long, too little manufacturing, formal manufacturing, and perhaps too much high-skilled services well ahead of its time. But there is a kind of international dimension also to this economic precociousness, which is captured in these 2 charts. So as you know, Devesh has done some excellent work on, the diaspora in India. And from that work, we've, compiled this chart on the left, which shows, take the different ethnic communities in the United States, calculate their average income in the United States, and compare it with their counterparts back in the country where they came from. So essentially, this shows the income per capita of immigrants, various immigrant communities, as a share of per capita GDP in the country of origin. And what you see strikingly is that India is the highest, not surprising at all. The average Indian household in the US earns about 32 times the average income household in India. And this is the greatest by an order of magnitude. And of course, we know why this has happened, or at least a manifestation, which is that, high-skilled talent left India and came to the United States and prospered. And, you can reel off a list of companies over the last 25, 30 years that have been headed by CEOs of Indian origin. But the thing is that key point to keep in mind is that Indian high-skilled talent exploited globalization through migration. The chart on the right is the sad counterpart of that. What this shows on the y-axis is what is the share of various countries in global exports of low skill products like, clothing, footwear, toys, electronics, etc. On the x-axis, you see that what is shown is the country's share of the labor force. And you see how China and India are complete outliers, but in different direction. China and India have similar share of the global labor force, about 22%. China has about 40% of accounts for 40% of global exports, and India accounts for 2 to 3%. So, in a sense, India overexploited high skilled people, overexploited globalization through emigration, and Indian low skilled labor was were kind of shortchanged because India did not exploit the opportunities through exporting low skilled goods like all these apparel, footwear, etc. And it kind of we show in the book that this was very costly. It cost us a lot of jobs, especially in manufacturing, and that's what kept India's organized labor force today is about 10%, and part of that owes to this fact that we underexploited, trade and globalization, and that was one big deficiency in India. The other sense in which we use the word precociousness is in terms of policy choices. As Devesh said, we build a lot of public sector enterprises, but didn't invest enough in public infrastructure. You take, we invested too much in, state-owned enterprises, not enough in human capital. Within human capital, as you know, we invested much more in higher education than in basic education. In health, we invested much more in population control and disease control than we did in public health, public sanitation, and primary health, and so on. We also, the precociousness extended in this, little bit quirky, eccentric way, where we enacted a lot of laws ostensibly to protect all kinds of interest groups without having any ability to actually implement these laws. And some of the, having these laws without being able to implement them also kind of backfired in ways which we can talk about. This is a chart that basically shows this kind of how we invested in public investment, but not public infrastructure, public investment, not in education. And you can see the education per student, how it was very low, and it only rises after the 1990s, which I'm just going to come to in a little while. I think Devesh spoke about the bridges, so this just extends that to other aspect of public infrastructure. I think one of India's, default mass ideologies is my Bapism. Basically, this is a philosophy or an ideology that is not the old socialism or investing in public goods or welfare. This is a mass ideology shared across the political spectrum, shared across societies, shared across regions, which basically says that we want the state to help us. Even if the state has, really shortchanged us, it has not given us, primary education, it has not given us basic health. Still, whenever things happen, the involuntary reflex reaction is for us to turn to the state to help. And that's the term my Bap, which is father, mother, the Holy Trinity, whatever. And one of the manifestations of this is what we show is the lack of exit. And what we mean by that is, the one example is we compile a lot of data for the first time from 1970 onwards for all the central public sector enterprises in India, as well as the most important state public enterprises. And this chart shows what the rate of return is. And essentially what you should take away from that, it's low, except for a brief period, when India boomed. And it's much lower than what could have otherwise been done with that capital, which we measure either as the rate on government bonds or the rate that a good private sector investment can fetch you. We show the same for state public sector undertakings, where it is much worse. So one of our themes in the book is whatever the central government does badly, the state governments do much worse. And then we quantify, the cost of this poor returns for public sector investment. We show that the total, if you add together, had you invested what you did in central and state public enterprises and got a reasonable return. I mean, this is an area that Ravi has worked on quite a bit as well. What we show is that the opportunity cost of this investment was about 1.25% to 2.5% of GDP every year for the last 50 years. Just to give it some texture, had the central public sector enterprises got a decent return, the central government could have invested about almost double in infrastructure every year. And the states could have invested 100 to 150% more in health had these enterprises done reasonably well. Where my Bapism comes in is that what we say is that the problem was not that India got into public sector enterprises, because as Devesh said, that was the zeitgeist of the time. The problem or the puzzle is why, despite 50 years of this, we were not able to get out of it. Devesh mentioned how we'd read all these reports. Actually, most of them were read by Devesh, not me. And one of the really amazing things you find, and what we say in the book, is the Indian state, and those 3,000 reports, if you read them, the Indian state is remarkably self-reflective. It knows public sector enterprises, it has looked at them again and again, and it has found the public sector enterprise to be wanting. So the Indian state has been remarkably self-reflective. It has also been self-flagellating, seeing that we've done wrong, but the problem is it's rarely been self-correcting. And why it didn't self-correct, we say my Bapism could be an explanation that, the belief that even if the public sector does badly, you want to continue relying on it because, you don't think there are alternatives. One of the other themes of the book is how we say growth changed everything in India. So in the debate between, is growth important or, redistribution important, we say that both are actually sides of the argument are incomplete, because actually economic growth changed everything in India. After the 1980s, and especially after 1990, poverty reduced and changed the economic lives, the access to goods and services. India was a different country after 1980, especially 1991. It changed the dynamic of education. As I showed earlier, the investment in education, educational attainment was actually pretty poor until 1990. But when economic growth took off, it had two very important impacts on education. One is that the state got more resources to spend, and that's what we showed in the earlier graph. After 91, state spending on education, even on primary education, takes off quite rapidly. But the second impact is that economic growth increased the returns to education, and therefore parents started putting their children in private schools if necessary in order to attain that education. So growth, growth also, which we show in the book, is that the Indian state became a much more caring state. The public investment, welfare state, all increased after 1990, especially after 2000. Devesh has some, again, excellent work earlier, which he showed how economic growth, actually had a huge impact on social mobility, on caste, eating together, and how in parts of India there was really exceptional social change as a result of economic growth. Now, tell me, Devesh, Ravi, can I, how much more time? 5 minutes, Ravi?
Yeah, yeah, 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. So, uh, one of the surprising things we find about India is that, yeah, so we put together this data on what is the average fiscal deficit of the country and compared it with other similar developing emerging market countries. And the surprise to both Devesh and me is that if you look at government deficits from 1990 onwards, both center and state together, India had the highest fiscal deficit amongst all these comparator countries. And this is, remember, after 1990 when India's growth took off. So during a period of rapid growth, we still had the highest fiscal deficit. And so what we say in the book is that this was possibly due to what we call this the Kamadhenu fiscal state, and we attribute it part to India's democracy, because what you find is that on the tax side, almost everyone is excluded from the tax net. The middle class, the rich, the landed people, the rich farmers, everyone, is excluded from taxes. And on the expenditure side, what we show is that almost everyone gets a subsidy, some form of subsidies or the other. So it's this Indian state is, Indian democracy, is not about just some big 3 or 4 big vested interests. It's about everyone having the ability to claim to be a special interest, and the Indian fiscal state kind of accommodates their concern. So, the Kamadhenu fiscal state is a manifestation of Indian democracy. There is an equal opportunity special interest creator, facilitator, and accommodator, and you see that in the fiscal state. Um, so, one of the other, very surprising findings in the book, and we talk about this, that if you start the clock in 1980, remember, especially for people who live outside India, for the NRIs, the question they always say is wistfully, oh, why can't India be like China? Why can't India grow as rapidly as China? Well, it turns out, and this came as a huge surprise to Devesh and me, that if you start the clock in 1980, one third of India grew almost as rapidly as China and for as long. And that's what this chart shows. And this one third of India is basically the southern states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Haryana. So the question should, at least one way of interpreting one lesson from this chart and this finding is that we should not think about how, why can India not be like China, but rather why can't the 2/3 of India be like the other 1/3 of India, which actually grew as rapidly and showed as much dynamism as China did. So it kind of changes our perspective on, focusing more on learning the lessons from within India rather than just focusing on, other countries. Um, uh, I'm going to, in the interest of time, Devesh, this whole, fiscal, recently, all these problems have emerged between the South and the North. Especially, the grievance has been articulated most forcefully by the South, that basically they're transferring too many resources to the poorer states. What this chart shows is above the line are the states that are beneficiaries of the transfers, i.e., they get more in fiscal resources than they contribute to the kitty, to the tax kitty, and the lines on below the black line, the red, the black, and things are the donor states who transfer more than they get. What you find, the two things interesting about the chart, or three things, you can see how, especially after 2000, these transfers are rising. The dotted line is the Hindi heartland. It's getting now twice as much as it's contributing. Uh, the other thing to note is that although the southern states have been the most vociferous in making the case, which is the red line. They are, in fact, not the largest contributors. In fact, it's the western states and Haryana that's actually transferred more in proportional terms. Now, why are the southern states therefore the most vociferous? We can get into it in the Q&A. It has to do with delimitation coming up and so on. We'll talk about that later. But I think why this grievance expressed by the South is not, entirely misplaced is because what you see with this pattern of transfers is that these transfers are rising and rising, and they seem to be rewarding underperformance by the North Hindi heartland and penalizing overperformance by the southern and the western states. So I think in a federal system, everyone accepts that there must be some transfers, but they shouldn't be open-ended and rising like they have been, and they should not, create perverse incentives and consistently reward underperformance and penalize overperformance. So I'm going to conclude. What do we conclude the book? First, the magic and paradox, how we created and sustained democracy that Devesh spoke about, and how we created a kind of capacious sense of the idea of India, which has flourished. Maybe it's under trouble now. And Devesh, as Devesh emphasized, the under-recognized achievement, how India used democracy for nation building, for creating order, for building a state, for building a sense of who is an Indian, and with very minimal violence. That was the under-recognized achievement. The delayed and partial success basically is on the economic side. And I'm going to show this chart. This chart shows per capita GDP of India and all the other countries in the world. What the numbers show, say, take a number like, 79 to begin with in 1950. That shows what is your ranking compared to other countries. In 1950, India's ranking, I can't see very well. What is it in 1950, Devesh?
79.
Yeah, 79. So India was 79th in terms of per capita GDP, poorest country. 1980, it slipped even further. So the first 30 years set us back. And then we had rapid growth. And today we are the 66th richest or poorest country in the world in percentile terms. That means there are 66% of countries are richer than India in terms of per capita GDP. So even though we've made a lot of progress, the average Indian is still quite poor in relative terms compared to people in 66% of other countries in the world. So that was the delayed and partial success. I think the durable disappointment that Devesh and I write about is basically how we haven't, improved human capital and created a sense of fraternity and really broken the stranglehold of caste and patriarchy. And this is a chart which is a comparable chart. It shows Human Development Index. It combines income, health, and education. And here the picture is even bleaker because in 1950 we ranked 63, i.e., it's like 63rd. 63% of countries had better Human Development Index than India did. And even though we've improved after 1990, today we're 69. So we've actually, over the course of 70 years, declined in relative terms in terms of our human capital achievement. The irony, and we can talk about this, is we show in the book that democracy gave, as Devesh spoke about, but democracy also made the challenge of economic development much harder. And I gave you the example of the Kamadhenu democracy, how it affected the fiscal state. And we end by saying we don't give any prescription, as Devesh said, but the looming tragedy, we say, is that all those early achievements, nation building, state building, avoiding violence, sustaining democracy, all of those are very, very hard earned and fragile achievements, strong institutions, good relations between the center and the state. The looming tragedy is that we should not lose those early achievements, because if you look around the world, our neighborhood, or other countries in the world, they have, as Devesh said, many of them have splintered, split up, experienced mass violence, experienced weak institutions, experienced political repression. And we have managed that, and kind of navigated such tricky terrain. We should not lose those very hard earned, fragile achievements. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Arvind. Thank you, Devesh. We're now going to invite questions. If you have questions, raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you. But as you think about your questions, would you get a mic to Valentina there, please? Okay, I'm going to just ask the one or two questions just to get the ball rolling. I'm wondering, Devesh and Arvind, as you did the analysis and you identified some very interesting, unique aspects of India, it seems to me there may be an opportunity to connect the dots. The individual insights you've got, can they be connected a little bit more? Maybe you do it in the book and it's hard to do in a presentation. For instance, you mentioned the connection between democracy and inflation, right? That because you have a democratic and the poor vote, therefore you're mindful of the inflation. And so that actually affects that outcome. You also mentioned that staffing is, the public sector is very much higher at the state level and not at the local level, as it is in some of the other countries. And that, but for instance, if you take the democracy argument, you might think that because everybody gets to vote, primary education would also become an important issue, and therefore the government would be mindful of it, and therefore will cater to that need, as they did with inflation. But maybe because staffing at the local level is weakest, and that is where these services are delivered, despite democracy, you end up not. So maybe there are some ways to connect some of the things you're saying, but it also leaves open the question of why in a democracy then was that not fixed? Why is it that the local was not strengthened? Because in fact, that's where you deliver these services. So that's one thought. The other one I wanted to raise is the role of the private sector, which neither of you mentioned the word private companies in your presentation. I always thought the private sector was India's great strength. And I used to think, when I saw the software IT revolution happen, that meet the Indian private sector halfway and then they will take care of the rest. So if you can't provide water, they'll arrange their own water. If you can't provide housing, they provide housing. If you can't provide satellite communication, so the same thing you see in the NGOs as well. NGOs fill the gaps in services that are not provided by the state. So I thought the Indian private sector is very dynamic. But then when you look at some other indicators, maybe it's still true at the small firm level, but not at the large firm level. At the large firm level, Indian private firms have not done nearly as well as you would have thought, given they were early movers compared to Chinese companies. And there are today 130 companies in the Fortune 500. And India has gone from like having 7 to having 9. So we've maybe added a company or two to that list. Why hasn't the Indian private sector done much better? I'll stop with that, and then if you want to respond, Arvind or Devesh, then we'll open it up to other questions. Yeah, let's wait for the response.
Devesh, you go first. I'll come in later.
Okay. So I'll start with the private sector. I think one of the bigger disappointments about the Indian private sector now, you can understand it in the first 30 years when public policy really stifled them. But the question is, one of the things, and when Arvind was the chief economics advisor, he did in one of his economics surveys, we worked together. One of the things that's really the Indian private sector is an outlier is its low share of R&D spending. In most emerging markets, especially China, etc., or Israel, US, and the European countries. The private sector is by far has the highest share of R&D spending. In India, it's the government. If you take Samsung and Reliance, largest companies, the ratio Samsung is about sales is about 250 billion, Reliance is about 125 billion, so it's about half. But the number of patents filed by each of these in the US, the ratio is 100 to 1. And one of the things that has happened is that the today, Indian markets are much less competitive than in China. China is a fiercely competitive the market. And India is not, because the big companies have really now got sort of oligopolies, etc. So they don't need to use innovation because they're making rents in sort of other ways. And so I think in terms of innovation, for sure, the Indian private sector has been much more disappointing. And unlike the past, it cannot blame just the state for its lack of dynamism in that sense. On your first question on, I think the Indian Constitution has very clear division of powers between the federal government and the state governments, but it did not have that it laid out some principles, but it was not there in the Constitution about local governments. That happened in the early 90s with the 73rd, 74th Amendment. But the basic problem is, this is where you see the challenges of the other side of democracy. And one of the things which we didn't show you the slides is the democracy is costly. India has, for its income, the most expensive elections in the world. So for these elections, you need to raise money. To raise money, the state governments have to keep control over urban India, because urban India is where the money is. The votes are in rural India, but the money is in urban India. So they have zero intention of decentralizing urban. That's why India's cities are in such bad shape, because there is simply no way the states want to give up that power, because that's where the money is. And you need that money in order to fight and win elections. And that is the other side of democracy, which we have to take into account. So, Arvind?
Yeah, so I just want to add a few things to what Devesh said, starting with the democracy. So, Ravi, I think you asked a very good question, and I think there is a theme running through the book, which is about first the precociousness, democracy before development, and so on, and therefore having got that politically precocious democracy. One of the themes running through the book is what did it give and what did it take away, and how it imposed these challenges. So that's kind of a broad theme running through the book. Maybe it didn't come out explicitly in the presentation, but you're quite right. That is one of the themes in the book. Now, your question, why didn't democracy self-correct? I mean, take primary education, for example, right? One of the finest pieces on why India didn't provide primary education is actually written from Cambridge, MIT. Myron Weiner wrote this book called The Child and State in India in 1990 or 91, basically saying that Indian society very hierarchical, and therefore elites did not find it in their interest to promote universal education. So Indian society is implicated in that. And so the one way of exemplifying to show the contrast is that where bottoms up movements, social reform movements, were important or were powerful and effective, like in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, you did get better improvements. In a sense, bottoms up social reform movements combined with democracy did produce these effects. So those social reform movements and changing society are, I think, quite important to attaining some of these outcomes. Now, on the private sector, just to add, to both what both Devesh said on both sides, I don't think we should, underplay. For example, our underperformance on unskilled manufacturing exports still has a lot to do with the heavy-handedness of the states of the state on the Indian private sector. Remember, licensing, domestic licensing was very unique to India. No other country said, we will protect you against foreign competition, and then turned around and said, no, no, you cannot, flourish. You have to come to us, and so on. So I think the overbearing state and the over-regulating state, had a big impact on this. And then on the other side, just to kind of reinforce what Devesh said, in the last 10 years, we have this policy of promoting private sector national champions. Remember, in the 50s to 80s, Ravi, your work, Devesh's work, it was about promoting national champions in the public sector. In the last 10 years, we've gone to a strategy of promoting national champions in the private sector. But as Devesh said, these are national champions. We know the obvious groups that, unlike, say, the chaebols of Korea, are mostly in regulated, non-tradable sectors, which are not subject to the acid test of foreign competition and exports. So that's the big difference between the national champions that Japan and Korea promoted and what we did. And so, because we promoted this in non-tradable sector, there's less competition, more concentration, as Devesh said. And unfortunately, there's also the perception that the playing field is no longer level between the big guys and the other part of the private sector. So today, many parts of the private sector feel that they cannot compete with the big national champions, and that is partly one reason why, for the last 5 to 10 years, private investment has been weak in India.
Thank you, Arvind and Devesh. Yeah, Valentina.
I have a couple of questions. I'm really impressed by the fact that India introduced universal suffrage so early on. It was about, the same year that France provided women with the right to vote, and even before, all of Switzerland did. And I'm wondering whether that was, was it a function of a legacy of British colonialism? I rather doubt that. Or was it actually the part of its socialistic approach to governance at the time and its affinity to the communist bloc and so on, even though, of course, India fell short on many of the other social indicators. And by the way, I was a little startled to see on one of your tables that women's fertility might have declined, but the life expectancy of women is still far below that of men. And that's just, did I read that incorrectly? Oh, I did. Oh. The life, okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so the question of where did this idea of giving women the right to vote early on come from? One other question about, legacies and affinity. Affirmative action. Can someone remind me when affirmative action was actually established in India? Did it follow the American path, or did it follow the Soviet path in that respect, since the USSR was the first one to have such kind of policies? Thank you very much.
I have to say, India did not borrow these ideas from outside. They were all indigenously, relentlessly debated in the 1920s, and the decision was taken in the Lahore conference of the Indian National Conference in 1928. And there was a report by Nehru and by Jawaharlal Nehru's father, who was a very prominent lawyer, and Jawaharlal Nehru was himself part of that committee. And right then they said, this is the only way we can build the country. So that was absolutely deep internal debates. There were some questions whether illiterate people will be able to vote, how they'll be thinking, but they had a very clear. There was in the Constituent Assembly debates, which are absolutely remarkable debates, there was almost no dissension from the very right or very left. There was this was one of the few areas unanimity was easy. The US followed India on affirmative action. In India is the first country that built it into its constitution. Affirmative action was built into the constitution itself, that the lowest caste and the tribal groups would get guaranteed representation in education, in political representation, and in government jobs. These were the three anchors. It's another story how it expands to other groups, etc. But it's the first country that introduces it into the constitution itself. In the US, it comes into law, but not in the constitution.
Devesh, can I just add, Ravi? So on both these points, I would urge all of you to read that report that Devesh mentioned. They actually have these discussions on should women have the right to vote. And it's remarkable how liberal their sensibility was in the 1920s to kind of dismiss all the arguments against women getting the right to vote. It's really remarkable. But the second thing I would say is that the independence movement in India was not elite. After Mahatma Gandhi came to power, it was a mass-based movement. So any mass-based freedom movement could not then turn around and say, oh, once we've attained independence, we've mobilized the masses, but we'll only give the suffrage to half the people. So the mass-based nature of the national movement also played a very important role. On affirmative action, I think we have to be very clear about something. The United States treated its disadvantaged minority adversely. 3/5 of blacks were equal to 3/5 of men. India was unique in the following respect. If you take South Africa, for example, after apartheid in 1994, they gave also extended affirmative action, but to the disadvantaged majority. In Malaysia, again, similar preference was given to the majority. India was the only country which gave extended affirmative action to historically disadvantaged minorities. And that sets India apart. And therefore, as Devesh says, it's absolutely unique and very different from what other countries did.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can everyone hear me? This is working? Great. Devesh knows I've been a fan and a student of his work for decades now, so it's really wonderful to learn about your latest publication with Arvind. I just wanted to make two observations and they're not intended to be provocative, but I'd be interested in your reactions to them. One is the condition of democracy in India at the moment, because the VDem Institute lists it as at 100 out of 179 countries, and now classifies it as an electoral autocracy due to excessive pressures on media and challenges to civil liberties. And the Freedom House now lists India as being only partly free due to its manipulation of elections, and it also observes one of the greatest shifts in democratic backsliding over the past decade, like in the world. It's a decline of about 15 percentage points. So that's the first observation. The second observation is my understanding is that real GDP growth in FY26 is expected to be 7.6%, which is higher than it was the previous fiscal year, way higher than China, higher than, well, many other countries. So the question, what is your reaction to that? Because your talk was mainly about India's democracy and kind of perhaps underperformance in terms of manufacturing competitiveness. And now I've just questioned the state of its democracy and noted its rapid growth.
So you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why when Arvind ended his last thing was the abiding irony is that all those past achievements are at risk. And that
The
was
looming
exactly
tragedy, Devesh. The looming tragedy.
so the looming tragedy, which was the last point, was referred precisely to that sentiment. And there's, I think, I mean, I don't know, all these VDEV, for those of you who don't know, there are all these different indicators of democracy. And many of them are subjective. They poll experts. The experts are largely people who believe in a certain view. So there are lots of issues. Notwithstanding all that, there's no doubt that Indian democracy has weakened. I mean, period. You can argue how much, etc., etc. That's a separate thing. But there's no doubt that the last 10 years, it is weakened, not just in several ways, whether it's civil liberties or the level playing field in electoral politics, all of that. And I think the fact that India's growth rate, Arvind has been writing a lot, questioning some of these numbers, but there's no doubt that India's growth is reasonably robust, especially when you look around the world. And, I mean, look, China grew fantastically for almost half a century. And once you grow for so long, for so far, and become an upper middle income country, you just simply cannot grow at similar rates. So China's relative decline is also pretty natural. And India is way behind China in per capita incomes and so on. So in that sense, it should not be particularly surprising because India has a big demographic tailwind, and China is facing demographic headwinds. That also is, and that, by the way, is going to continue to be there over the rest of the century. I mean, like to give you one sort of figure on how much the demographics shapes this. Between 1950 and 2025, India added 1 billion people to its population. Between 2025, the next 75 years, India will add a net 0. That is the stark difference between the previous 75 years and the next 75 years. Meanwhile, in the next 75 years, China's population will decline between 2/3 to half, if we see the way the demographics are growing. So demographics going forward, at least, are going to play very different roles than they played in the past. Arvind?
Yeah. So just 2 points. I think I would just add on the democracy point that sadly this is a global phenomenon. That it's not just in India's VDEM index that's declining. I mean, the bigger surprise is how democracy has come under stress, even in advanced economies, especially the United States. In fact, Martin Wolf had a piece in yesterday's Financial Times where he showed the decline in the VDEM index in the United States has been faster than in India over the comparable period of time. So I think when we look at that, we have to see this, understand this, why this is happening in a broader global context, and that's something we can debate. On the second point, I think that, remember, there's absolutely no connection between democracy and growth over short periods of time. And as Devesh said, even over long periods of time, while there may be some correlation, we know that China is such a stark outlier that, under completely non-democratic conditions, it has achieved the fastest growth ever seen in humanity. So I think certainly one should be very cautious about drawing any conclusions on the relationship between democracy and growth over short periods of time, and even over longer periods, because, to use a cliche, it's kind of complicated. What explains growth gets kind of complicated.
Thank you, Arvind. Our time is almost up. I'm so sorry. I know wish we could go on much longer. It turns out this room is going to be used by a dance troupe. So unless you want to join the dance troupe, we need to get on to the next phase, which is dinner. So would you join me in thanking Devesh and Arvind for Thank you again. This has been just a wonderful treat. The book will be released in the US in May, and so you can buy it. We wish we had copies here that you could sign and take with you. But the book is going to be available next month. Oh, I know, that's in India. It's available. In India it's available, but you can't get it in the US. I mean, they had a wonderful write-up and a review in The Economist, a full-page write-up on The Economist, but no copies to buy, Arvind. Market is not working quite the way you would think it would. Even the private sector, even in the West, is not always getting its act together.
Okay, but Ravi, can I say one thing on that? Devesh and I have been struck by how efficient Indian publishers have been and how shambolically inefficient the American publisher has been.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me, on that note, say thanks again, once again, Arvind. We wish you could have been here, but wish you a quick recovery and complete recovery. And Devesh, again, thank you so much. I urge you to read the book. I did get a PDF copy from Devesh, and it's also so well written, so lucid that you can get through all of the very dense stuff very, very easily. So thank you all.
Thanks, Ravi.